the destruction of Pharaoh's army, and water from the rock at Massa and Meribah. And then you have the manna from heaven, and the quail in the evening. And so most recently, what we saw last chapter was the victory over the Amalekites. If you recall, when Moses would hold up the rod of God, they would have victory, and when he let it down, they'd start to see defeat. But here we've seen God just demonstrating His power and provision at every turn, every single twist and turn that's come their way. He's shown Himself mighty and delivered the children of Israel. Now in this chapter 18, it's going to be a little bit different. No plagues, no miracles, no battles. Instead, we're going to see a bit of a family reunion and some very practical advice about leadership, and just kind of seeing Moses getting some counsel from an elder, his father-in-law, and that's just sandwiched between a chapter about victory over Amalek and then giving of the law in the next chapter. But something to remember. You hear a lot and read a lot of God working in the Bible through these big spectacular moments. These moments where He really shows His power and comes through in really extraordinary ways. But then He also works in the ordinary too. The mundane, the things we don't think about, the things we take for granted. God's still in the midst of those, and He's still working. Sometimes He's parting the sea like He did a few chapters back, but then other times He's sending us wise counsel through godly people, godly figures in our life, and that's where we'll see. But Israel at this point we'll read here in a minute, that they're camped at the Mount of God. That's Mount Sinai or Horeb, the same mountain where Moses encountered the burning bush. And it's been some time after leaving Egypt, so they've been in this quite a ways, and they've of course traveled the Red Sea crossing and through the wilderness of Shur to Elam, and to the wilderness of Sin to Rephidim, and now to Sinai. So they've come quite a long ways. But we'll see a few things here. One, the importance of family, and two, power of testimony, and then three, the danger of overwork, and wisdom here in delegating. So in chapter 18 of Exodus, we'll start in verse 1. It says, "When Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land, and the name of the other was Eleazar, for the God of my father said he was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the Mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her." We'll pause there for a moment. Notice there in verse 1, begins, Jethro heard of all that God had done. So the word had traveled, despite being, wandering through the wilderness for some time. The word had gotten back to, Jethro. So the fame of what, God had done in Egypt had, spread throughout the region. No doubt, the Egyptians left behind, they, had told, the traders that come into Egypt and different ones, and the word spread. And of course, the plagues, they weren't just for, Israel's benefit. They weren't just to help Israel escape, but they were also, a testimony to the surrounding nations that, the God of Israel, this is the one true God. He's, having a real work here in Egypt. And then, of course, God told Pharaoh through Moses, and in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show thee in thee my power, and that my name be declared throughout all the earth. That's back in Exodus chapter 9. But God, I don't want to say he made an example of Egypt or Pharaoh, but in a sense, he really used that situation to show himself powerful with the dual purpose of, also bringing out his people, Israel. And so we have, Jethro, hearing what God has done, and, he responded here. He didn't just marvel from a distance, he came. He brought Moses' wife Zipporah and their 2 sons with him, and he come to see what it was all about, what was going on. Of course, Jethro, we hear of him in Exodus chapter 2, also called Reuel, but he was a priest of Midian. Of course, the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through a second wife, Keturah. So Jethro and Moses, they had this common ancestor in Abraham. So the connection there, it kind of explains, why Jethro, worshiped the true God. That faith had been preserved in some form among the Midianites. So Jethro wasn't a pagan priest; he was a worshiper of the same God of Abraham. Then verse 2 tells us Moses had sent her back at some point, had sent his wife back at some point. We don't know exactly when this happened. Scripture doesn't tell us, but I would imagine, everything going on during the plagues in Egypt wouldn't have been a very good atmosphere to, have a family in, and, the tense exchanges he'd had with Pharaoh up to that point, and the plagues that, had hit Egypt. No doubt he would have probably got his family out of there. He didn't know, what Pharaoh might do, what he might be up against. So just a practical decision there he made. And now we see the father-in-law bringing him back. And then you see the name of Moses' sons. I like how it explains kind of the meaning behind them. You've got Gershom, the first one there, a stranger or a sojourner, an alien in a strange land, as it says. You think of Moses' story. He was born to a Jewish mother, raised up an Egyptian, kind of aristocrat, I guess you'd say, and now he's, on the run out in the middle of the wilderness. So, he really, and he became a Midianite shepherd in that time span too. So really, he doesn't really fully belong anywhere. He's just, he's been so many different places and been displaced, and so, no doubt it would really feel like you're a stranger in a strange land, and it's easy to empathize with. But then we have the second son, I'm going to butcher the name, but Eliezer, means to my God is help. The God of my father, he's my help, as it explains there. And I believe this is the first mention we've seen of Eliezer in Exodus here. But you see that progression from the first son, Gershom, I'm a stranger in a strange land, to Eliezer, my God is my help. The first one, reflecting the alienation, the displacement he felt, and then his second son, reflecting the faith and the deliverance he found in God. So over time, Moses, his perspective shifted from I don't belong to, God has helped me. He's seen me through. He's delivered me, and that's. I guess we can feel that way sometimes too. When you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, you're born a new creature. You're not. The Bible says to be a peculiar people. So naturally, you're not going to fit into the world. You're not of the world anymore. In that sense, you're born of a new creation, and it's easy not to feel alienated. But that's really that's a good thing if you can't identify with the world, because that means you're not going along with the world. We know where the world's going. It's not going to heaven. It's going to hell. But when we also remember, we take that with the fact too that God is our deliverance. He's our present help. That's the proper, I think, balanced perspective to have to no, I don't belong here. I'm out of place, but God is my help. God is my deliverance. He'll see me through a passage in this life, and he'll be with me. And I think that's the that correct balance reflection there, as we see. And then we see verse 6. We get Jethro's greeting, I guess, or the words he sent ahead. He sent ahead, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, come unto thee. So he doesn't show up, just unannounced, drop in. He kind of announces his arrival formally. So there's a dignity and a respect in that. Even family members honored, one another with, a proper greeting, proper communication. And I think it just goes to show, the relationship that Jethro and Moses had. He was, Moses fled Egypt and, lived in the land of Midian there for, was it 40 years, I believe. And, so he, built that relationship with his father-in-law. And, it was clear they had a good bond between them. Does anybody have anything there, though, before we can go on? Go to verse number 7. It says, And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and did obeisance and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly he was above them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came, and all the elders of Israel, to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. We'll pause there. We see in there in verse 7, something kind of neat, and just shows the respect that Moses had for his father-in-law. You have Moses, someone, being used by God to deliver, God's people. This great deliverer of Israel, the man who had, confronted and faced down Pharaoh, and now he's leading approximately 2 million people into the wilderness, into their home. But he still, he, as it says there, did obeisance to his father-in-law. He bowed. He showed respect. He recognized him as an elder, and showed respect to him. And even despite Moses' position, in leadership over this people, he didn't become arrogant because of it. He still honored family relationships and showed deference to his elder, to his father-in-law. And it's easy to fall into that human trap of feeling like you're in charge, or whatever it may be, and or have the slightest bit of responsibility given to you, and then suddenly you just think you get the big head, I guess, and it's just human nature. But we see Moses there. I think after what happened in the last chapter with the water and all of that, and being chided, and now he probably didn't care for his leadership role too much. I mean, it's a great responsibility, but one given to him by God, and so one that he was bound to keep. Romans 12:10 says, "Be kindly affection one to another with brotherly love, and honor, preferring one another." And so, even despite Moses being used by God to lead the people of Israel, he still shows that brotherly love and honor and toward his family. And then we see there in verse 8, the testimony says he told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done. So, this wouldn't have been the quick, cliff notes, just the quick bullet points, but it was a full, recounting everything that happened, and I'm sure I'm sure Jethro had gotten some secondhand piecemeal, what had happened, but he probably didn't have the full picture. But the plagues, the Passover, the Red Sea, the manna, the water from the rock, the victory over Amalek. Moses rehearsed, everything God had done. He had everything, every way God had been faithful to them up to that point. And you notice that Moses wouldn't have just told about the victories, but he also told, as it says there, all the travail that had come upon them by the way. The hardships, the complaints. Moses had just got done dealing with a pretty trying time. They couldn't find water, and the people were getting upset with him. He thought he was about to be stoned. The hunger and the attacks by other nations, and so Moses gives an honest testimony. Both the blessing and the struggles. It's an authentic witness. We don't have to pretend that following God is easy, and but it's easy to testify that God's faithful. And we hear different testimonies that oftentimes they can just be all triumph and no struggle, and then others are all struggle and no triumph. But the best testimony, the most honest way to share what God's done is to tell of both the trying times and the moments of triumph where God's delivered. Moses told Jethro both of the travail and the deliverance. And so that's that pattern through many tribulations. But God delivers. I think that just goes to show you, just how faithful God is, even when things get so low and get so hard. He's still there. I think that just amplifies so much more the triumph when we have to go through the tragedy, I guess. And if it's all just riding the high all the way up, people can't get a blessing out of that because they can't relate to that, because life's not really like that. There's low points and there's high points, and so we have to be honest in our testimony. And that just shows you, look where God's taken me, look where He's brought me from to get to this point, and that can be a blessing to others there. And it no doubt was a blessing to Jethro, because you see there in his response in verse 9 to 11, he rejoiced, he blessed the Lord, and he makes a declaration there, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. I don't believe he had a doubt in his mind for 1 second that he wasn't already, but that's the further proof. And when we give testimony of what God's done in our lives, that can be such a great blessing for others. That can be an encouragement to them. That can further solidify our faith, and really just further us in that. So of course Jethro, he no doubt knew that. He was a priest, presumably of the one true God, as his father Abraham was. And but there's a difference between believing something and then seeing it lived out, seeing it confirmed. We hear of how God works and what He's done, but to actually see it in someone else's life, that someone close to us, to see how God's worked in their life and see how He's delivered them. That be so close to it, I guess, and even our own personal testimony, it just has a greater impact. It just goes to show that He's not only in other people's lives, He's in all of our lives, and He's willing to be that deliverance for us. Does anybody have anything there, though? So verse 11 there says, "For in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, He was above them." The Egyptians were, they were proud of their gods, the Nile, the sun, their livestock, the firstborn. And, God in the plagues, He kind of tore down every one of them. Everything they were proud for, everything they were proud of, He turned the Nile to blood. He darkened the sun. The livestock died off. The firstborn were all slain. Egypt's pride become very quickly Egypt's shame. God defeated them, in all the very ways and things that they boasted in. And it just goes to show you, when you put things above God, when you put your pride, put things come between you and God, don't treasure those too much, because He can very well, take those away. He can turn those into shame very quickly when we're not putting things in their right place. Exodus 12:12, going back a little bit, it says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." And God takes it very personally. We know that from the Bible that God is a jealous God, and He very personally, took offense to every single one of these little g gods that they put on a pedestal and worshipped. But he'll quickly, just as quickly, knock them down. Then we have that verse 12 there. Jethro, of course, being a Midianite priest, he offers a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And you see Aaron and all the elders come in to eat with him before God. A Gentile priest is leading worship. He wasn't born of Isaac. He was born of a later son of Abraham's. And so we have a Gentile priest leading worship, and Israel's leaders all participating. It's kind of a foreshadowing of, the inclusion of all the Gentiles in God's plan, and, something more fully revealed later on in the New Testament. I just like that foreshadowing there. Isaiah 56 verse 7 says, "Even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon my altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people." And so we know that was, God had His chosen people, but we know from the start that it was His design that He would use Abraham and his seed to bless all the nations. And so all the nations, have a part in that redemptive plan of God's. And so, that's a little bit of foreshadowing. But does anybody have anything there, though, before we move on? Move on to verse 13. It says, "And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did to the people, he said, What is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning unto even? And Moses said unto his father-in-law, Because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and His laws. And Moses' father-in-law said unto him, The thing that thou doest is not good. Thou wilt surely wear it away, both thou and this people that is with thee, for this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone." So here's I would imagine the next day, after the celebration, after, the reunion moment here of Moses and his family, and the feasting and the worship here. The next day, normal life picks up right where it left off. And Jethro, he sees Moses, sitting as kind of a judge from morning until evening, all day long, and a line of people, stretching back probably as far as the eyes can see, waiting to bring their questions, their disputes to Moses. And, you think about, they estimate some 2 million or so Israelites. Even if only a fraction of them had, a question or a dispute or something on any given day, that would still be, hundreds or thousands of people. So, a lot on his shoulders, a lot for him to bear, for Moses. And, one man trying to handle all of that, and, Moses would be, working himself into the ground, as it says, from morning until evening. So, Jethro, he questions him there in verse 14. what is this thing that thou doest? Why sittest thou thyself alone? Jethro, he doesn't question whether the work needs to be done. He sees the necessity of it, but he questions, why are you doing this alone? Why is this your burden alone to bear here? And Moses there in verse 15 and 16, it reveals his heart. He's not that he's power hungry or that he has to be controlling or micromanaging or in charge. He's not a control freak or whatever, but he, believes that this is his responsibility. The people come to me to inquire of God. I judge between one another. I make them know the statutes of God, as he says. So Moses, sees himself as that conduit between God and God's people. So I guess he feels a great burden of responsibility there. You see in churches, the danger you can have in, having, one person doing so many different things, and the danger of, burnout. It's not, being lazy or negligent. It's just Moses was doing too much. He had too much on his plate. To be one person settling the disputes of so many. He was, just kind of working himself to death here. Sometimes, the hardest workers, in their best intentions, they still need someone to tell them, hey, you need to slow down, you need to delegate out or something here. Not because the work's not important, but, the worker is, and, they can't work themselves into the ground here. So Jethro, his assessment there is pretty blunt. The thing that thou doest is not good. Just put it simply, it's not good, Moses. Moses, he'd been faithful, he'd been diligent, self-sacrificing, but Jethro tells him it's not good. It's not that the work's not good. It's just you can't do this all on your own. Good intentions don't always guarantee the best methods, the best ways to do it. You can be doing the right thing, but doing it the wrong way. And then verse 18 there, thou will surely wear away both thou and this people. Moses this pace here, it was unsustainable, but it wasn't just hurting him, it was hurting the people too. We've already seen in previous chapters, this is the most patient people in the world. When they get a little bit thirsty, they get pretty angry. So when they're standing in line all day, I'm sure they're not too pleased to be standing in line all day. Just imagine going down to the courthouse and having to renew your driver's license, how long that line is and how terrible that is. But you can just imagine their frustration. I would say it would at some point boil over. Their questions, their disputes or whatever, they weren't, being resolved efficiently. And Moses, he was attempting to do everything himself, but he was just kind of failing everyone, and himself included. Galatians 6:9 says, let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. But the phrase there, too heavy for thee, it echoes what you later see in Numbers when Moses cries out to God, I'm not able to bear all this people alone because it is too heavy for me. So Jethro, he foreseen this problem here before, Moses was really even ready to admit it. Sometimes having that outside perspective, is helpful in identifying that. So it's not on us to to do everything, to take everything upon ourselves. We all have a part to play, and we should all labor diligently. But it's not on us to do it all either, to be a one-man show. Does anybody have anything there though? We'll pick back up in verse 19, and it says, hearken now unto my voice, I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt shew them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s and rulers of 10s. And let them judge the people at all seasons, and it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So shall it be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. If thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure. And all this people shall also go to their place in peace. We'll pause there. Jethro doesn't just point out the problem. He offers some good advice, some good counsel. He offers a solution. It's easy to point out the problem, but it's not overly helpful unless you got a potential solution to go with it. What he offers here, pretty easy to identify as a model for sort of an organizational leadership, a structure. But there in verse 19 and 20, Jethro defines what only Moses can do. Be thou for the people to Godward. So represent the people before God, in prayer and intercession, bring the causes unto God, seek God's wisdom on, the difficult matters, and then teach them ordinances and law. So, providing them that spiritual instruction and direction. Of course, we see that later when law was given. And then show them the way wherein they must walk. So, show vision and set the standard, be the example. And so, these are the basic responsibilities, for Moses, for his leadership. Things that, he can't necessarily delegate out. The things that, he has to pray, he has to seek God, he has to teach, and he has to, set direction. But judging every dispute, some of that can be shared, some of that can be broken off. Over in Acts chapter 6, verse 2, it says, Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them and said, It is not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look ye out among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the word. So you see that delegation, putting people in their proper place to be able to serve effectively, delegating out responsibility. So you see that principle sort of repeated there in Acts. The apostles, they had a similar problem: too many needs and not enough work hands to meet the need, not enough hours. So of course the solution there was delegate the serving of tables to qualified men so they could focus on prayer and going on the word. Jethro's counsel here would kind of become what they would imitate later on. And then we see verse 21, so the qualification for those who would share in Moses' burden. First it says able men, so those who are competent and capable, not just willing, but able. Good intentions, aren't enough, but you actually need to be able to, do the job as well. And then it says, such as fear God. So they have to have, that right relationship with God above too, before they can handle, the disputes between others. So godly judgment requires, godly judges naturally. And then men of truth, as it points out. So men who are honest and trustworthy, won't be swayed by lies or pressured into false decisions. And then hating covetousness. So men who are incorruptible, you can't bribe them. They have integrity. They're not in it for personal gain. A judge who can be bought is not a judge at all. They're just up for the highest bidder, I guess. So you see the order there of qualification. There's the ability and godliness, honesty, integrity. But Jethro didn't say to find the most educated or pick the wealthiest or choose the most popular. So character precedes competence in God's eyes. You can train skills, but you can't easily train character. You either have it or you don't. And so this structure that Jethro, he lays out, You have the rulers of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens. It creates a sort of a layering. If you have a dispute, you start with the ruler of 10, and if it can't be resolved there, you move on up to 50 and to 100 and so on. And then only the most difficult cases then, of course, reach Moses. So it's a kind of filtering system that allow the majority of issues to be handled, where they can be. And then verse 22 there makes clear that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So Moses is still handling, the big questions, the big disputes. The precedent setting, question. Those things that are complex. But the routine, the everyday, those get handled by, the qualified people that are chosen closer to the situation there. You've got the rulers of 10s and the 50s and so on. So you've got people that are closer circle there. And in verse 23, after all that, advice that Jethro gives, there's still an important caveat there in verse 23. It says, if thou shalt do this thing and God command thee so. So, Jethro is humble enough to, acknowledge that his advice still needs divine confirmation, still needs God's say so, is okay. And he's not claiming to speak for God. He's just offering wisdom that Moses should seek God for approval on. Good counselors know the difference between thus saith the Lord and here's my idea, my suggestion. Proverbs 11 verse 14 says, where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety. So, counsel, godly counsel especially, is a good thing. Sure. And then the result of that, if God okays, he, affirms, then it says, thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. So, this delegating, it's not just good for the leader, but it's good for everyone. Moses endures. The people, they have their questions, their disputes answered, resolved, and it's for the benefit of everyone. And I think it aids in the growth of those who are chosen to preside over these. So it's there's benefit all around there. Does anybody have anything there though? I think the parallels you can draw to pastors and deacons and things like that. I think that's pretty clear. It's a lot of the same qualifications. Godliness, able, incorruptible, those things, and it really kind of paints a model for for the church. Anything else there, though? We'll pick up in verse 24, read out the rest of the chapter, and it says, verse 24, so Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law, and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of 50s and rulers of 10s. I think I left out some words there. I'll read that again. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. So you see there in verse 24, so Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. So think about Moses to this point, what all he's done. He's, the man who spoke face to face with God at the burning bush. He's been, given so much responsibility. He performed the signs and wonders before, Pharaoh. He, up to this point, has, helped to deliver Israel and be a prophet of the Most High. The leader of, some 2 million people or so. And, he's taking advice from his father-in-law. He's still humble enough to, know when good advice comes to, maybe hearken to it. I think that's, something valuable that no matter what, a state or a position we reach in this life, that doesn't mean we can outgrow or, ever not need, good godly counsel, apart from us. I think it's good to, to foster those kind of relationships with, good Christian people and people you can confide in and trust in and to go to for that kind of counsel and that kind of godly advice. And so it's a humility that he shows. Moses didn't say that, who are you to tell me how to lead? There always be some tension in those, in-law relationships, but God, he could have said, God called me, not you, but he didn't get defensive. He didn't foster an ego. He listened and he recognized wisdom and, presumably, confirmed it with God, and he hearkened to it and implemented it. And so we see that advice lived out, so to speak. Proverbs 12, verse 15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. And I don't think it matters what position or estate you reach in life. I mean, it's always good to hearken unto good godly counsel, seek good godly counsel. And then we have, does anybody have anything there, though, before we continue? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Or yeah. Yep. That would make sense. You know, absolutely. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you think of how he started. A prince of Egypt. I mean, I guess second in command. Yeah. Yeah. and bold enough to kill an Egyptian and just think he can get away with it, and then outcast to Midian for 40 years to be a shepherd, and it's a long way to humility, and yep, yep, it is. Yep, a hard way to learn it too. But and I think it just goes to show he has learned it. Maybe in some sense it was a way of God testing him to see that he had humbled himself before he would go to Mount Sinai. So it goes to show you how he's progressed and developed here. But thank you, brother. Anybody else got anything there? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I like how when does Jethro leave? In the last verse, after they've put all this into place, after he's kind of stayed to see it through. Hey, I gave you this idea. I'll help you. Make sure it comes to be. You've sought God's counsel, and he's affirmed it presumably, and so I'll help you see it through. I mean, it'd be one thing to just toss a suggestion against the wall and bail, and not see it through. But he actually he stays to see it through, and I think that's important too. And I think it just goes to show you the relationship they had. I think they had a good relationship. Moses being in Midian for 40 years and working closely alongside the family and all that. So then verse 25, we'll try to wrap up here pretty quick, but Moses executing the plan, able men out of all Israel, became the judges, the rulers at various levels. And, it says Moses shows them. He didn't just accept volunteers. He didn't hold elections. He used discernment to, identify the qualified people here. So the selection matters. Not everyone who wants responsibility should have it, and not everyone who's qualified will volunteer for it either. So the leaders have to be, chosen carefully. And then verse 26, shows the system working. They judge the people at all seasons, constantly, regularly, as needed. And then, of course, the hard cases went to Moses, and the more routine, everyday things were handled by the delegated people, leaders. So it was a shared burden, and the system, it functioned the ways it should be. And then we see verse 27 closing the chapter out. Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way in his own land. So Jethro came and he delivered Moses' family. He shared his wisdom. He worshipped with Israel and helped them implement this advice. And he returned home. His role was complete. He didn't try to stay and take over or have a hand or whatever. He didn't demand a position or whatever. He served and he stepped back. Numbers 10 records Moses urging Hobab, likely Jethro or his son, to stay with Israel as a guide through the wilderness. Judges 1:16 mentions the descendants of Moses' father-in-law settling in Canaan with Judah. So it seems like the family at least maintained their connection to Israel. They remain connected. A Gentile family, grafted with God's people. Numbers 10:29, that verse. Moses said unto Hobab, the son of Raguel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying into the place of which the Lord said, I will give it you. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good, for the Lord hath spoken good concerning Israel. So we see that connection, staying together as a family would. So a few things we can draw out from the chapter. God sends wisdom sometimes through unexpected sources. He puts people in our life that good family or good friends to give us good godly wisdom. And then even faithful workers, even the most faithful, they still can have flawed methods. Still not doing the right thing, but going about it the right way, having your heart in the right place. But there's a better way to do it sometimes. And then burnout doesn't just hurt you, but it hurts others too. Those around you. Mark 6:31 says, "And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place, and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat." So they had no free time so much as even to stop and eat. We're not supposed to burn out. And then delegation requires trust and discernment. We should discern those who serve us or lead. The qualifications matter. They don't just hand out responsibility to whoever's available, but you hand it to those who are capable and godly and honest and incorruptible. And you trust them to do what they've been given to do. And then stay focused on what only you can do. You can't be a million different places at once. You have to understand that God's given you only so much you can do, and you just do it faithfully and truthfully as you can, and you can't do more than what God can allow you to. Then good counsel, even when you do good godly advice, you should seek God too in that, and seek His will in that. If we foster a lot of good godly relationships in our life, that's certainly a blessing. To have them to confide in and to to pray with and to get advice from, and but it's still we should go to God too with those things and trust in Him too. And then testimony leads to worship. When Moses told Jethro of everything that God had done, Jethro worshipped with him. He rejoiced with him. It says. He says, "Now I know that God is mightier than any other God." So when we share what God's done for us, it can stir faith and praise in others around us. It can embolden them. It can give them encouragement. And our testimony is not just our story, but it should be an invitation to point others to God and to glorify God along with us there. So, does anybody have anything there though? Else? Right, I appreciate you all tonight, your time and attention. You want to shut down the live stream?